The ruthless billionaire walked in unexpectedly. What he saw his fiancée doing to the maid shocked him. "I wasn't going to share this, but I have to. Because some nights don't just change a relationship, they rip the mask off someone you thought you knew completely." This is a story about a man who built an empire from nothing, a woman who almost took all of it from him without ever touching his bank account, and a maid who never asked for anything, yet ended up being the only honest person in that entire house. What happened on that rainy night, behind those grand doors, still gives me chills. And by the end, you'll understand why he never looked at success the same way again. Hey, welcome back to the channel. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from tonight, and which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Tonight's story is heavy on emotion, heavier on betrayal, and it carries a twist I promise you will not see coming until it's already happened. Stay until the end, because the real heart of this story doesn't show up until later. Let's get into it. Money doesn't always show up the way people expect it to. Ethan Cole was 34 years old, and by every outward measure, he had already won at life. He was the founder of Coldwell Dynamics, a tech company that had grown from a garage in Ohio into a name recognized on Wall Street. He had the penthouse, the private jet, the kind of bank balance that made headlines. But none of that had come easy. Ethan had grown up poor, raised by a single mother in a 2-bedroom rental outside Columbus, a woman who worked double shifts as a hospital janitor just to keep the lights on. She used to tell him, "Son, the size of a man's wallet says nothing about the size of his heart. Watch how people treat those who can't do anything for them. That's the real test." He never forgot those words. Not even after the money came. Not even after the world started treating him differently. 3,000 miles away, in a modest apartment above a laundromat in Newark, a woman named Grace Bennett was folding towels at midnight, humming quietly to keep herself awake. Grace was 32, a single mother to an 8-year-old daughter named Lily, who was asleep in the next room with a nebulizer humming softly beside her bed. Lily had severe asthma, and the medical bills never seemed to stop climbing no matter how many hours Grace put into her 3 jobs. She cleaned houses during the day, waited tables 3 nights a week, and on weekends she had recently taken a live-in position as a housekeeper for a wealthy family in Connecticut, a family she'd been referred to through an agency. She hadn't told them much about her past. She never did. Some things were easier left buried. Grace hadn't always cleaned other people's houses for a living. Years earlier, she had been a private caregiver, the kind hired to sit with the dying and make their final months gentler. One of her last clients, before everything in her life fell apart, had been a kind, tired woman in Ohio named Diane Cole, Ethan's mother. Grace remembered Diane vividly. She remembered the small house that smelled like lavender and old books, and the teenage boy who used to come home from his part-time job smelling like grease from the auto shop, exhausted, but who always stopped by his mother's bedside first before doing anything else. Grace had cared for Diane during the last 4 months of her life. She had held her hand during her final breath. And then, like all jobs eventually do, that chapter closed, and life moved Grace somewhere else entirely. She never spoke of the Cole family again. Ethan Cole, the boy from the auto shop, had grown into a name she sometimes saw flash across news banners, and each time, something quiet and proud stirred in her chest, though she never told anyone why. She had no idea that the mansion she now cleaned every day, tucked behind iron gates in Greenwich, Connecticut, belonged to that very same boy. Ethan had hired Grace through an agency 6 months earlier, at a time when he was buried under 100 business meetings and had no time to personally interview household staff. His fiancée, Vanessa Marsh, had handled most of it. Vanessa was 33, elegant, sharp-tongued when she wanted to be, and came from an old money family who had lost most of that money 2 generations ago but never lost the attitude that came with it. To the public, Vanessa was poised, photogenic, and endlessly charming. She smiled for cameras like she'd been born in front of one. Ethan had met her at a charity gala 18 months earlier, and she had seemed, at first, like exactly the kind of partner a man like him needed. Someone who understood the world he now lived in, who could stand beside him at galas and know which fork to use and which senator to compliment. What Ethan didn't know, what he had no reason to suspect, was that behind closed doors, Vanessa treated the household staff like furniture. Cold when unwatched. Sharp when annoyed. She had already forced out 2 housekeepers before Grace, both of whom quietly quit without explanation, too afraid or too proud to say why. Grace had lasted longer than either of them, mostly because she needed the paycheck more than she needed her pride, and because Lily's medicine wasn't going to pay for itself. Tonight was supposed to be simple. Ethan was in Chicago for what should have been a 2-day investor summit, and Vanessa had planned an engagement celebration at the Greenwich estate for close friends and family while he was away, meant as a surprise reveal of the wedding venue mock-up when he returned. 50 guests. A live quartet. Vanessa in a shimmering silver gown, moving through the marble foyer like she already owned every square inch of it, which, in her mind, she practically did. Grace had been asked to work a double shift that night, serving hors d'oeuvres, managing coat check, keeping the household running invisibly in the background the way good staff are trained to. She missed Lily's bedtime for it. She'd called to check on her twice already, quietly, from the pantry, promising she'd be home by 2 in the morning. She had no idea that somewhere over Pennsylvania, Ethan's flight had been rerouted early due to a cancelled morning meeting, and that he was already driving home through a building storm, 2 full days ahead of schedule, heading straight into a night that would change everything he thought he understood about the woman he was about to marry. Nobody in that house expected the storm to arrive from 2 directions at once. By 9 o'clock, the party at the Colmarsh estate was in full swing. Crystal glasses clinked under the chandelier in the grand foyer, string music drifted from the sitting room, and Vanessa Marsh moved through her guests like a queen holding court, her silver gown catching the light with every turn. She laughed at the right moments, touched arms at the right moments, and made sure every photograph taken that night would show a woman utterly in control of her perfect world. Grace worked the edges of the room, refilling trays, directing the small serving staff, trying to be invisible the way she'd trained herself to be in every house she'd ever worked in. It was easier that way. Fewer questions. Fewer chances for someone like Vanessa to notice her and decide she needed correcting. It was around 9:30 when Vanessa first reached for her neck and found it bare. The necklace was a family heirloom, a diamond and sapphire piece that had belonged to Vanessa's grandmother, one of the last truly valuable things left from a family fortune that had long since evaporated. She had worn it earlier in the evening for photographs. Guests had complimented it. And now it was gone. What happened next moved fast, the way panic always does when it's dressed up as authority. Vanessa didn't quietly search for it. She didn't calmly ask her assistant to check the guest room where she'd changed earlier. Instead, she turned toward the small cluster of household staff gathered near the kitchen doorway, her face shifting from hostess perfect to something colder in half a second, and announced, loud enough for the music to nearly stop, that her grandmother's necklace had been stolen. "Someone in this house took it," she said, her voice carrying across the marble floor. "And I think we all know exactly who's been in and out of my dressing room all night." Every eye in the room turned toward Grace. Grace felt her stomach drop. She hadn't been anywhere near Vanessa's dressing room all evening. She'd been running coat check and refilling champagne trays, and at least 4 other guests could likely confirm it if anyone bothered to ask. But nobody asked. Vanessa had already decided, and in a house where Vanessa's word functioned as law whenever Ethan wasn't present, deciding was often the same as proving. "I didn't take anything, Miss Marsh," Grace said quietly, her hands trembling slightly as she set down the tray she was holding. "I've been at the front door and the kitchen the entire night. You can ask anyone." "Convenient that you'd say that," Vanessa snapped, stepping closer, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. "You've been strange since the day you started here. Quiet. Always watching. I should have listened to my instincts months ago." A few of the other staff members shifted uncomfortably, eyes down, none of them willing to speak up against Vanessa in front of 50 of her closest friends and family. Grace scanned the room, hoping someone, anyone, would say something. Nobody did. Fear has a way of making silence feel like the only safe option. Empty your pockets, Vanessa said. Right now. In front of everyone. Grace's cheeks burned with humiliation as she turned out the small apron pockets of her uniform, revealing nothing but a folded napkin and a pen. It proved nothing, and yet it seemed to satisfy no one, least of all Vanessa, who had already decided the outcome before the question was asked. Search her bag. Her locker. Whatever she brought into this house, Vanessa ordered one of the security staff, her voice rising with theatrical outrage now, playing beautifully to the small crowd of onlookers who had gathered at the edge of the foyer, drinks in hand, watching the scene unfold like it was part of the night's entertainment. Grace's small bag was brought from the staff room and dumped onto a side table in front of everyone. Her keys, a photo of Lily, a half-eaten granola bar, a folded piece of paper with her daughter's medication schedule written on it. No necklace. Still, Vanessa's expression didn't soften. Then you must have already passed it to someone outside, Vanessa said, her voice sharpening into something cruel and performative all at once. Get on your knees. I want a full explanation before I call the police. The room went silent except for the quartet, who had awkwardly stopped playing halfway through a phrase. Grace hesitated, humiliation and disbelief warring on her face, but the fear of losing this job, the job that paid for Lily's inhaler, her nebulizer, her school supplies, pressed down harder than her pride. Slowly, she lowered herself to her knees on the cold marble floor, right there in the middle of the grand foyer, in front of 50 strangers in evening wear, holding wine glasses, watching. Vanessa stood over her, one hand on her hip, the silver gown pooling elegantly around her heels, looking every bit like a woman who believed she had just protected her home from a thief. Outside, the storm that had been building all evening finally broke loose in full force, rain hammering against the tall windows of the estate. And through the sheets of water pouring down the long driveway, headlights turned in through the front gates, 2 full days earlier than anyone inside that house was expecting. Ethan Cole had planned this to be a surprise. He'd texted Vanessa from the airport that his meeting had wrapped early, then decided against it, wanting instead to walk through the front door and catch her off guard, maybe with flowers in hand, maybe just to see her face light up the way it always did in photographs. He'd driven the last hour and a half himself, refusing his usual driver, wanting a little quiet time to think after 2 exhausting days of pitch decks and handshakes. The storm had made the roads brutal, rain slashing sideways against his windshield, but he'd pushed through it, eager to get home. He parked just outside the front entrance, noticing with mild confusion the long row of cars lining the circular driveway. Bentleys, Range Rovers, a few he didn't recognize. Music drifted faintly from inside, and lights blazed from every window of the estate. He stood there for a moment in the pouring rain, blue suit soaking through at the shoulders, trying to make sense of what looked like a full-scale event happening in his own home without him. He stepped up toward the tall open doorway, water running off his jaw, and that's when he saw it. Through the doorway, past the small crowd of guests gathered in his foyer, he saw Vanessa standing tall in a silver gown, her arm outstretched, finger pointed downward at a woman kneeling on the marble floor in a red and white maid's uniform. He recognized the uniform. It belonged to the newer housekeeper, the quiet one he'd exchanged maybe 3 sentences within 6 months. And if you don't confess right now, Vanessa was saying, her voice carrying clearly out into the rain, I will make sure you never work in this state again. Do you understand me? Ethan froze in the doorway, rain dripping from his hair, utterly unnoticed by the room full of people whose backs were mostly turned toward him, all of them fixated on the scene in front of them the way people fixate on a car accident they can't look away from. He had never seen this version of Vanessa. Not once. Not in 18 months of dinners, weekend trips, family holidays, and quiet mornings. The woman standing in his foyer right now, cold-eyed and commanding, speaking to another human being like she was something to be discarded, was a complete stranger wearing his fiancée's face. But it wasn't only Vanessa that stopped him cold. It was the woman on her knees. Something about the way she held her shoulders, the quiet dignity she carried even while being humiliated, tugged at a memory buried so deep in Ethan's chest that for a moment he forgot how to breathe. He took one step further into the light spilling from the doorway, and the maid's eyes lifted, just briefly, just for a fraction of a second, and locked onto his. And Ethan felt the floor tilt beneath him. He knew that face. Older now, tired in a way it hadn't been before, but unmistakably the same. It was the woman who had sat beside his mother's hospital bed for 4 months when he was 19 years old, changing her 4 bags, reading to her when the pain medication made her too weak to hold a book, humming old hymns under her breath at 3 in the morning when she thought no one else was awake to hear her. The woman who had held his mother's hand during her final breath while Ethan sat frozen in the hallway, too scared to walk into the room. The woman who had hugged him afterward, the only person in that entire hospital who had looked at his grief and simply let him have it, without trying to fix it or rush him through it. Grace. Her name had been Grace. He hadn't thought about her in 15 years, not because he didn't care, but because life had swept him forward so fast. His mother's death, his father's remarriage 2 years later, dropping out of community college to chase the business idea that eventually became Coldwell Dynamics, that some memories simply got buried under the noise of survival and ambition. He'd wondered about her once or twice over the years, wondered what happened to the kind woman who'd been there during the worst weeks of his life, but he'd never gone looking. He hadn't known how. And now she was kneeling on his marble floor, in his home, being screamed at by the woman he was about to marry, while 50 strangers watched and did nothing. For 1 full second, Ethan Cole didn't move. Rain dripped from his sleeves onto the polished stone. His chest felt like it had been cracked open. And then something in him, the part of him that still remembered his mother's voice, still remembered what she'd taught him about watching how people treat those who can't do anything for them, pushed him forward through the doorway and into the light. Vanessa. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The single word landed in that foyer like a thunderclap, and every head in the room turned at once. The color drained from Vanessa's face for exactly 1 second before her instincts took over. Ethan. Oh my God, you scared me, you're 2 days early, she said, already moving toward him, arms outstretched, her voice sliding smoothly back into its warm, hostess register as if the last 10 minutes hadn't happened at all. Baby, you're soaked, come inside, let me get you a towel. What is going on here? Ethan asked, not moving toward her, his eyes still on the woman kneeling on the floor. It's nothing, it's just, my grandmother's necklace went missing, and I was handling it, Vanessa said quickly, waving a manicured hand as if brushing away a minor inconvenience. You know how these things go. I'm sure it'll turn up. She's on her knees, Vanessa. The room had gone completely silent now except for the storm still hammering against the windows. 50 guests stood frozen, drinks in hand, suddenly very interested in the marble floor beneath their own feet. She was being uncooperative, Vanessa said, a slight edge creeping back into her voice, the kind of edge that came out whenever she felt cornered rather than in control. I was simply asking her to explain herself before I called the police. Ethan walked past her without another word and crossed the foyer, kneeling down in front of the woman on the floor, rainwater still dripping from his hair onto the marble between them. Up close, there was no mistaking it. Grace, he said quietly, and his voice cracked slightly on the single syllable. It's Grace, isn't it? The woman's eyes widened, and something in her carefully composed exhaustion broke apart. Ethan, she whispered, and then, catching herself, added quickly, Mr. Cole. I'm sorry, I didn't know this was your house. I never made the connection, I swear, I would have said something. Don't apologize, he said, reaching out and gently helping her to her feet, ignoring the audible gasp that rippled through several of the watching guests at the sight of the billionaire host kneeling on the floor to help his own housekeeper stand. You have nothing to apologize for. He turned to face the room, and to Vanessa, his expression harder than anyone in that house had ever seen it. This woman, he said, his voice steady now, carrying clearly across the silent foyer, took care of my mother during the last 4 months of her life. She sat with her every single night when I was too young and too scared to do it myself. She held my mother's hand when she took her last breath, because I couldn't bring myself to walk into that room. I owe this woman more than most people in my life, and I just watched my fiancé force her to her knees in my own home over a necklace that hasn't even been properly looked for." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Vanessa's face had gone pale, her earlier composure cracking at the edges. "Ethan, I didn't know, obviously I didn't know who she was to you. But that doesn't change the fact that my necklace is missing and someone in this house. Has anyone actually searched the dressing room where you changed?" Ethan asked, cutting her off, his tone still calm but with a hardness underneath it that Vanessa clearly wasn't used to hearing directed at her. "Has anyone checked under the vanity, in your coat pockets, in your overnight bag? Or did we go straight to accusing the housekeeper and making her kneel in front of 50 people? Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it. A flicker of something passed behind her eyes, not confusion, but something closer to calculation, the look of someone quickly recalculating a plan that had just gone sideways. "I'll have someone check," she said stiffly. "I'll check myself," Ethan said. "Right now. Everyone, please, enjoy the rest of the evening. I apologize for the interruption." His public composure was returning, the businessman's instinct to smooth over a crisis in front of an audience kicking in even as his mind raced. But before he turned to head upstairs, he looked back at Grace, who stood trembling slightly near the wall, mortified, exhausted, and clearly unsure whether she still had a job. "Go sit down in the kitchen. Get warm. Nobody touches you again tonight," he said quietly, "just for her. I mean that." Grace nodded, tears finally slipping down her cheeks now that the immediate danger had passed, and one of the younger kitchen staff gently guided her away from the crowd of watching eyes. Ethan climbed the staircase 2 steps at a time, guests parting for him, and disappeared down the hallway toward Vanessa's dressing room, leaving behind a foyer full of whispers and a fiancé whose careful, camera-ready world had just cracked wide open in front of everyone who mattered to her social standing. What he found in that dressing room 10 minutes later would turn out to be only the beginning of what he'd learned that night. Because the necklace, it turned out, had never been stolen at all. Ethan found the necklace in less than 4 minutes. It was sitting in the inside pocket of a black overnight bag tucked beneath Vanessa's vanity table, half hidden under a folded silk robe. Not lost. Not misplaced by accident. Deliberately tucked away in a bag that, judging by the plane ticket receipt sticking out of the side pocket, was already packed for a 2-day trip to Miami that Vanessa had not mentioned to him at all. He stood there for a long moment, holding the necklace in one hand and the ticket in the other, feeling something colder settle into his chest than even the storm outside had managed. The ticket was for a flight leaving the next morning. 1 passenger. Vanessa Marsh. Return date left open. And tucked in the same pocket, a folded printout of a wire transfer confirmation, $28,000, sent 3 days earlier to an account under a name Ethan didn't recognize, a name that, when he searched it quickly on his phone right there in the dressing room, belonged to a small private lending firm known for high-interest personal loans to clients trying to stay quiet about gambling debts. It didn't take a genius to start putting pieces together. Vanessa hadn't misplaced her necklace during the party. She'd hidden it in a bag she was planning to disappear with the next morning, likely intending to quietly pawn or sell it once she was away from prying eyes, to cover a debt Ethan clearly knew nothing about. When it had gone briefly missing earlier in the chaos of the party, perhaps knocked loose while she packed hastily between greeting guests, instead of admitting she'd hidden it herself, she'd seized the opportunity to stage a dramatic accusation against the one person in the house least likely to be believed over her. Ethan sat down slowly on the edge of the vanity bench, the storm still rattling the windows, and allowed himself 30 seconds to feel the full weight of what he'd just uncovered before he had to go back downstairs and face a room full of his closest friends and family, plus the woman he'd asked to marry him. He thought about his mother. Diane Cole had never had money, not really, not in any way that mattered by Wall Street standards. But she had raised him with a kind of moral clarity that Ethan sometimes worried had gotten buried under 14 years of boardrooms and acquisitions and investor calls. Watch how people treat those who can't do anything for them. That's the real test. He thought about how many times over the past year he'd brushed off small comments from Vanessa about the household staff, A sharp word here, a cold dismissal there. Telling himself she was simply particular, that wealthy families had different standards, that he shouldn't judge his fiancée's management style too harshly. He'd made excuses for months. Tonight had made those excuses impossible to keep making. Downstairs, the party had thinned considerably, guests slipping away quietly into the storm once the initial shock wore off, uncomfortable lingering in a house where they'd just watched their host's composure crack in public. Vanessa was pacing near the fireplace in the sitting room when Ethan came back down, her arms crossed tightly over her silver gown, her performance mostly abandoned now that most of the audience had gone home. "Did you find it?" she asked, too quickly. Ethan held up the necklace and the folded papers without a word, watching her face carefully. Vanessa's expression flickered, a half-second of panic quickly smoothed back into indignation. "You went through my things." "I went looking for a necklace you told me was stolen," Ethan said quietly. "Instead I found it hidden in a bag packed for a trip you never mentioned, next to a wire transfer for $28,000 to a lender that specializes in gambling debt. So I think the question isn't whether I went through your things, Vanessa. I think the question is why you let a woman kneel on our floor for something you did yourself." Vanessa's mouth opened, closed, opened again. For the first time since Ethan had met her, he watched her search for words and come up completely empty. "It's not what it looks like," she finally managed. "Then tell me what it looks like," Ethan said, and for the first time in 18 months, his voice carried none of the warmth she'd become used to. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the woman I asked to marry me was willing to destroy someone's reputation, someone who took care of my dying mother, to cover up her own mess and slip away to Miami without me ever knowing." Vanessa said nothing. Outside, the storm cracked with a long roll of thunder, and somewhere down the hallway, in the warmth of the kitchen, Grace sat wrapped in a blanket one of the younger staff members had brought her, still shaking, still trying to process the fact that the tired, kind teenager she'd once comforted at his mother's bedside had grown into the man who'd just knelt down and lifted her off the floor. The rest of that night passed in a strange, brittle quiet. Ethan asked the last remaining guests to head home, apologizing with the polished grace of a man who'd spent years learning how to manage a crisis in public even while falling apart in private. Vanessa retreated upstairs without another word, and Ethan didn't follow her. Instead, he walked toward the kitchen, where Grace sat at the small staff table, a mug of untouched tea in front of her, still wrapped in the blanket, staring at nothing. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "I'm sorry," he said. "For all of it. For not being here sooner. For not recognizing you the moment you walked into this house, for however long you've worked here without me knowing." Grace shook her head slowly, wiping at her eyes with the edge of the blanket. "You had no reason to recognize me. It's been 15 years, Ethan. I didn't recognize the house address when the agency placed me here either, not until I was already 3 weeks into the job and it was too late to say anything without it seeming strange. Why didn't you say something once you realized?" Grace let out a small, tired laugh that had almost no humor in it. "Because I needed the job. Because I have a daughter with severe asthma and medical bills that don't care about awkward reunions. Because the last thing I wanted was for you to think I'd taken this job on purpose, hoping you'd remember me and give me special treatment. I wanted to earn it honestly, the same as anyone else." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, something in his chest aching in a way he hadn't felt since the week his mother died. "You held her hand," he said quietly. "When she passed. I was in the hallway. I couldn't make myself walk in." "I remember," Grace said softly. "You came in about 10 minutes after. You sat with her for an hour before anyone else came to take her. I never thanked you properly. I was 19 and falling apart, and I never even asked what happened to you afterward. You were a grieving kid, Ethan. Nobody expects a grieving kid to remember to say thank you." They sat in silence for a moment, the storm finally beginning to ease outside, rain softening to a gentle patter against the kitchen windows. "Tell me about your daughter," Ethan said eventually. Grace's face changed at the mention of Lily, the exhaustion softening into something warmer, more vivid. Her name's Lily. She's 8. Sharp as anything, wants to be a marine biologist because she's obsessed with sea turtles. She's got severe asthma, has since she was 3, and it means I've spent the last 5 years working every job I can find just to keep up with the medication and the hospital visits her father stopped helping with a long time ago. Where is she right now? Asleep at our apartment. My neighbor checks on her when I work late shifts like tonight. Grace looked down at her hands. I was supposed to be home 2 hours ago. Ethan stood immediately, pulling out his phone. I'll have my driver take you home right now. Tonight. And Grace, he paused, choosing his next words carefully, you're not going to lose this job over any of this. If anything, after everything you did for my mother, and now after what just happened tonight, this house owes you far more than a paycheck. Grace looked up at him, something cautious and disbelieving in her expression. The look of a woman who had learned the hard way not to trust promises from people with more power than she had. You don't owe me anything, Ethan. I did what anyone decent would have done for your mother. Maybe, Ethan said quietly. But not everyone would have done it the way you did. And not everyone in this house tonight would have stood back up off that floor with the kind of dignity you did, after being treated the way you were treated. Over the following days, while Vanessa retreated into a tense, simmering silence upstairs, Ethan quietly pulled the household security footage from the party, reviewing every angle of the foyer and the upstairs hallway leading to Vanessa's dressing room. The footage confirmed everything the wire transfer and the packed overnight bag had already suggested. Vanessa slipping upstairs twice during the party, once to tuck the necklace into her bag, and again nearly an hour later when it had apparently shifted loose and she'd quietly panicked, deciding in that moment that accusing the housekeeper was safer than admitting the truth. It wasn't a moment of confusion. It had been a calculated risk that simply hadn't gone the way she'd planned. Ethan saved copies of everything, said nothing to Vanessa about what he now knew for certain, and waited for the right moment to bring the truth fully into the light, not just for his own sake, but for Grace's, who deserved a real, undeniable end to the accusation that had forced her to her knees in front of 50 strangers. The confrontation came 4 days later, in the same foyer where it had all started. Ethan had asked Vanessa's parents to come by the house under the pretense of discussing wedding logistics, a request Vanessa had eagerly agreed to, likely hoping the presence of her family might smooth over the tension that had been simmering silently between them since the party. What she didn't know was that Ethan had also quietly asked Grace to be present, along with 2 members of the household staff who had witnessed the accusation firsthand. When everyone was gathered, Ethan didn't waste time on pleasantries. He placed the necklace, the wire transfer printout, and the plane ticket on the coffee table in front of Vanessa's parents, along with a tablet queued up to the relevant security footage. I think we need to have an honest conversation, he said, about what actually happened at the party last week. Vanessa's face went white. Ethan, this isn't the time. It's exactly the time, he said, calm but immovable. Because I watched my fiancé force an innocent woman to her knees in front of 50 guests, over a necklace Vanessa had hidden in her own overnight bag, packed for a trip to Miami she never told me about, right next to a wire transfer to a lender that handles gambling debt. Vanessa's mother's hand flew to her mouth. Her father's jaw tightened, his eyes darting toward his daughter with something between confusion and dawning suspicion. You don't understand the pressure I've been under, Vanessa said, her voice cracking now, all pretense finally abandoning her. You have no idea what it's like trying to keep up appearances, trying to be the perfect fiancé for cameras, for your business partners, for everyone watching us every single second. So you decided the solution was to humiliate someone who has nothing, who can't fight back, who was in no position to defend herself against you. Ethan's voice remained level, but there was an edge underneath it now that silenced the room. Grace held my mother's hand while she died, Vanessa. She's worked in this house for 6 months, doing everything asked of her without complaint, and the first real crisis that came up, you decided her humiliation was an acceptable price for covering your own mistake. I didn't know she meant anything to you. That's exactly the problem, Ethan said quietly. It shouldn't have mattered whether she meant anything to me. She's a human being who works in my home. That should have been enough. Vanessa's mother turned to her daughter, her voice tight with a kind of controlled horror. Vanessa, is any of this true? The gambling debt. It's under control, Vanessa snapped, some of her old fire returning even as everything around her crumbled. It was going to be handled quietly, the way these things are always handled, if certain people hadn't gone snooping through my private things. Private things kept in the house I pay for, Ethan said, hidden from the man you were about to marry, while an innocent woman knelt on the floor to cover for you. The room fell into a heavy silence. Grace, standing quietly near the doorway, said nothing, her presence alone doing more to underline the truth of the situation than any accusation could have. I think, Ethan said finally, turning to face Vanessa directly, that this engagement is over. Vanessa's composure finally shattered completely. You're going to throw away 18 months over some housekeeper. I'm ending this because of who you became the moment you thought no one important was watching, Ethan said. My mother used to tell me that the real test of someone's character is how they treat people who can't do anything for them. You failed that test in front of 50 witnesses, Vanessa. I just happened to walk in at the exact moment it mattered most. Vanessa's parents didn't argue further. Her father, visibly shaken, quietly apologized to Grace on his way out, a small gesture that seemed to genuinely startle her. Vanessa left the estate that same afternoon, her belongings packed into the same black overnight bag that had started the entire unraveling, her engagement ring left on the kitchen counter without a word. The house felt different after she left, lighter somehow, as if a held breath had finally been released. Ethan stood in the quiet foyer that evening, looking at the spot on the marble floor where Grace had once knelt, and made a quiet promise to himself that nothing like that would ever happen in his home again. The weeks that followed brought a kind of change Ethan hadn't expected to need, but recognized immediately once it started happening. He gathered the household staff, all 12 of them, from the groundskeepers to the kitchen team, and sat down with each of them individually, something he realized, with some shame, he had never once done in the 2 years he'd owned the estate. He asked about their lives, their families, the things that had gone unspoken and unnoticed under the previous arrangement. He raised wages across the board, implemented clear boundaries around how staff could be spoken to, and made it plain that any future concerns could be brought to him directly, without fear. But it was his relationship with Grace that shifted the most, in the quiet, unforced way that real change usually happens. He learned that Lily's medical bills had put Grace nearly $40,000 into debt over the past 3 years. Debt she'd been chipping away at with 3 jobs and almost no sleep. Ethan didn't hand her a check and call it solved. He understood, somehow instinctively, that Grace's pride mattered as much as her circumstances. Instead, he quietly arranged for Lily to be seen by one of the country's leading pediatric pulmonologists, a specialist Ethan's own company had funded research for years earlier, and made sure the arrangement went through Coldwell Dynamics' employee family health program rather than as a personal favor, a distinction that mattered enormously to Grace when she finally understood it. He also asked Grace, gently, over a period of weeks, about what she actually wanted for her life, beyond survival. It turned out Grace had trained as a nurse's aide years earlier, before caregiving work had become inconsistent and she'd had to take whatever jobs paid steadily. She'd always dreamed, quietly, of going back to finish her nursing degree, something Lily's illness and 3 jobs had made impossible to even consider. Ethan didn't offer to pay for her degree outright. He understood by now that Grace needed to feel she was earning her own path forward. Instead, he restructured her role at the estate into part-time hours with full benefits, enough to keep her afloat while she enrolled in night classes at a nearby community college, something she began 3 months after that stormy engagement party that had changed both their lives. You don't have to keep doing all this, Grace told him one evening, watching him help Lily with a jigsaw puzzle at the kitchen table, something that had become an unplanned but regular occurrence over the past several weeks. You've already done more than enough. I'm not doing it because I owe you, Ethan said, glancing up at her. I'm doing it because you're the reason I remember who I actually am, underneath all this. He gestured vaguely at the grand house around them. My mother used to say money doesn't change who you are, it just reveals it faster. I let myself forget that for a while. You reminded me. Lily, oblivious to the weight of the conversation happening above her head, held up a puzzle piece triumphantly. Found the turtle's shell. Both adults laughed, and for a moment, the house felt less like a mansion and more like a home, something it hadn't quite managed to be in a very long time. Autumn came, and with it, a quiet rhythm settled over the Greenwich estate that neither Ethan nor Grace had expected but both had grown to treasure. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan asked Grace if she'd come with him somewhere. No explanation given, just a request wrapped in something gentle and slightly nervous, an expression Grace had never seen on the confident businessman's face before. She agreed, and Lily stayed behind with one of the household staff, delighted at the prospect of an entire afternoon dedicated to her turtle documentaries. Ethan drove them nearly 2 hours, back toward Ohio, to a small, quiet cemetery on the outskirts of Columbus. Grace understood before he said a word. They stood together in front of a modest headstone that read Diane Cole, beloved mother, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. I haven't been back here in almost 6 years, Ethan admitted quietly. Business kept getting in the way. Or maybe I just didn't want to feel what I'm feeling right now. Grace reached out and took his hand, the way she had once done for his mother in her final weeks. She'd be proud of you, Ethan. Not because of the company, or the money. Because of what you did for a woman who worked in your kitchen, when doing the easy thing would have meant looking away. Ethan wiped at his eyes, unashamed. She used to talk about you, you know. In her last month. She said the woman taking care of her had the kindest hand she'd ever known. I never knew your name until years later, when I found her old journal and saw it written there, Grace. I always wondered if I'd ever cross paths with you again. Grace felt her own eyes fill with tears. I think about her often. She used to hum this old song, something her own mother sang to her, and near the end, she asked me to keep singing it to her so she wouldn't feel so afraid. I still sing it to Lily sometimes, when she's sick and can't sleep. They stood together at the grave for a long while, the autumn wind moving gently through the trees around them, two people bound together not by circumstance or convenience but by something far rarer, a debt of kindness paid forward across 15 years, finally, quietly, coming full circle. On the drive back, somewhere past the Pennsylvania border, Grace looked over at Ethan and said softly, "For what it's worth, I never expected any of this. Not the job, not seeing you again, not any of it. I was just trying to keep my daughter breathing and my bills paid." "I know," Ethan said. "That's exactly why it means something." Neither of them rushed to name what was quietly growing between them. It wasn't the kind of thing that needed a label right away, not after everything both of them had survived to get to this point. It was enough, for now, to simply exist in each other's company without pretense, without performance, without the exhausting need to prove anything to a watching world. It was, in its own quiet way, the most honest relationship either of them had ever had. A year later, the Greenwich estate looked much the same from the outside, the same iron gates, the same long driveway, the same grand marble foyer where, once, a woman had knelt in humiliation while a room full of strangers watched and said nothing. But everything inside that house had changed. Lily's asthma had improved dramatically under her new specialist's care, to the point where she'd started swimming lessons that spring, something her doctors said would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. She still wanted to be a marine biologist, and now had an entire bookshelf dedicated to sea turtles, most of it gifted by Ethan, who never missed an opportunity to encourage her curiosity. Grace had finished her first year of nursing school with honors, working toward the degree she'd shelved for nearly a decade to survive. She still worked at the estate, though her role had shifted entirely. She now helped manage the household staff, ensuring the culture Ethan had worked so hard to rebuild stayed intact, treating every single person under that roof with the same dignity she herself had once been denied in front of 50 strangers. Ethan had restructured Coldwell Dynamics' internal policies as well, quietly implementing better protections and benefits for support staff across all of his company's properties, inspired directly by the mistake he'd let slide for far too long in his own home. He never spoke publicly about the reasons behind the changes. Some things weren't meant for headlines. Some things were simply meant to be done right, quietly, because it was the right thing to do. As for what grew between Ethan and Grace, it never became a spectacle. There was no dramatic public proposal, no headline-grabbing wedding announcement. It simply became what it had always quietly been trying to become since that stormy night in the foyer. Two people who had been honest with each other from the very beginning, in a world where almost no one else around them had been. Looking back, Ethan often thought about how close he'd come to marrying someone who saw kindness as a weakness, and how one unexpected early flight home had spared him a lifetime of never knowing who Vanessa truly was until it was far too late to undo the damage. He thought, too, about how strange it was that the same woman who had once held his dying mother's hand would end up, all these years later, helping him remember exactly the kind of man his mother had raised him to be. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this. Pay attention to how people treat those who can't do anything for them. Not the people at the top of the room, not the people whose approval might benefit you. Watch how someone treats the person serving the coffee, cleaning the floor, or kneeling in front of a room full of strangers with nowhere else to turn. That's where the truth always shows up first. Money can buy a beautiful home, a beautiful gown, a beautiful smile for the cameras. It cannot buy character. Character reveals itself in the smallest, quietest moments, and sometimes, if you're lucky, those moments arrive at exactly the right time to save you from a mistake you'd have spent the rest of your life paying for. If this story moved you tonight, take a second to hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there are so many more stories like Ethan and Grace's waiting for you here. And if someone in your life needs a reminder tonight that kindness is never wasted, even when it feels invisible, please share this with them. Thank you for staying until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.